Good morning. It is our pleasure and honor to introduce our first speaker, Mr. John Jost.
John is the Associate Director of Admissions for Thomas Aquinas College. He worked in higher education since the founding of the college's New England campus in Massachusetts. He now speaks of the importance of Catholic education, the impact it had on his life, and how it could change the world.
Before working for Thomas Aquinas College, John worked in Chicago as a business consultant for a Fortune 500 company. While in high school, he was recognized as a state champion swimmer. John and his lovely wife, Grace, and their two young children reside in Massachusetts. Besides his interest in education and swimming, John loves baseball and ballroom dancing. I recently saw John dancing with his wife, and he did the dip. Very impressive, John. Please help us welcome Mr. John Jost.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. I was not suspecting ballroom dancing to be brought up, but thank you. Esteemed guests, Mac DeLozier, McHenry County Prayer Breakfast organizers, Father Calloway, it is a pleasure and honor to be given the opportunity to speak today at this gathering. Now, as I look around this room, I knew I would know some of you here. I've been surprised and happily surprised to see even more than I expected. And so some of you may know me, many of you do not. I have grown up in this area and was raised just a few miles down the road. In fact, I've been to this hall many times before. I even remember coming here as a little kid when I was around 6 years old for my first swim team banquet. Many years later, as Fred has introduced, I was back here as a state champion swimmer for the state of Illinois. And this accomplishment set me to, thank you. And naturally, as you might guess, that accomplishment set me to contemplating swimming at the college level. Now, this summer, heading into my senior year of high school, my mother signed me up for a high school summer program at a college I didn't know much about. The one thing I did know was that they did not have a college team, a swim team. In fact, they didn't even have a pool. Nonetheless, I decided I was up for an adventure and gave the 2-week program a try. This experience had a profound impact on my life, and I would not be speaking here today if it weren't for that exposure. What I experienced was a taste of an education that I simply couldn't resist pursuing because of the wonder it stirred in my heart. A wonder concerning the natural and supernatural realities around me. This was a Catholic liberal education, of which I am a graduate. This kind of education is very unlike the typical education of today, and most do not understand what it even means, which is somewhat ironic since higher education was originally built on the foundation of a Catholic liberal education. The benefits I received from such an education have been countless, and I cannot help but desire to share these with you so that you may benefit likewise in your own way. Now, my goal in this talk is not to speak about myself. The aim of this talk is to examine what a Catholic liberal education is and the profound value it can have on one's life, family, community, and the world. And I will do this in 3 parts, but primarily exploring the principles upon which this kind of education, when done correctly, is built upon. The first part will consider the proper and primary aim of education, and this is pertinent to, again, all levels of education. Second, by considering what a liberal education is, its methods, and its means. Third, by considering what makes an education Catholic, and ultimately the result of Catholic liberal education taken together. Lastly, time permitting, I will also make a few remarks on the practicality of such an education. So we're going to take them, break it down into parts, and then bring it together. Now, while there are many important reasons to consider this topic, I want to emphasize 3 that highlight the relevance of this for all of us here today. You might be thinking, I'm no longer a student. Why would this be pertinent to me? And here's 3 reasons why I think this is especially important to all of us here. The first reason is this. As Father alluded to in his homily this morning, there is an imminent crisis in education today, and particularly Catholic education. Now, I'm sure you don't need much convincing from me on this point. Education seems to be in the news every day now, and it is almost never good news. There are many obvious problems with education today, but perhaps most concerning are the countless new theories on what to teach and how to do so. These new theories are almost always primarily concerned with race, religion, and now gender identity. They're constantly being pushed to younger and younger audiences, and with deliberately less and less parental involvement and supervision. Thomas Sowell, in his book Inside American Education, quotes John Copperman as saying, quote, "For the first time in the history of our country, the educational skills of one generation will not surpass, will not equal, will not even approach those of their parents." The National Education Association summarized the trends among Catholic school enrollment. The U.S. Catholic school enrollment reached its peak during the early 60s, when there are more than 5.2 million students in almost 13,000 schools across the nation. The 70s and 80s saw a steep decline in both the number of schools and students, and by 1990, there was less than half of that amount just 30 years prior. And in the last 10 years alone, there's been an even further drop of 21.3%. It's been steadily declining for a long while. These statistics seem to indicate a growing awareness and distress at the tendency of Catholic schools to secularize themselves and intentionally lose their Catholic character. The second reason this topic deserves consideration is that liberal education, by nature, examines the deepest and most important questions about one's life and purpose. Some of these questions include the following. Is there a God? Can I know this with certitude? What is the interaction between God and man? What is truth? Does truth exist? Is truth relative? Is mathematics the only science with complete certitude? How do different sciences explain reality when reaching seemingly contradictory conclusions? Is one science more true than another? Is the soul material or immaterial? Can the soul's immortality be demonstrated? What is the good life? How does one achieve happiness? These are questions which mankind has always pondered. Almost all of the greatest minds and authors have thought and written and disagreed upon such subjects. Not only does this speak to how difficult these questions are, but it also demonstrates that one can easily hold the wrong opinion. Now, we all hold opinions concerning these questions, whether we're aware of it or not. Whether subconscious or consciously made, these are fundamental questions, the answers to which determine how we live our life. And I want to point out that one must have an answer to these questions. They are unavoidable questions to which we all must have an answer to. The third reason to consider Catholic liberal education is a hopeful one. Education contains immense power and potential. Because education influences the mind, and our minds govern the decisions we make, education thus directs the way we live. Archbishop Fulton Sheen once said in his Life is Worth Living series, quote, "Every idea that we have tends to some kind of expression. Our actions, therefore, can betray our ideas. It has been said that it makes no difference what you believe. It all depends on how you act. This is nonsense because we act upon our beliefs. As food determines our health, so our ideas go into the making of our behavior." Now, before we go any further, since I will be speaking about education, I want to be clear. and that this talk is in no way meant to be an endorsement or unendorsement of any particular school. I'm speaking of principles of education and not about specific schools. Granted, I will use my own experience throughout to illustrate examples along the way. I nonetheless encourage you to apply these principles to your life. And I do intend that all levels of education can benefit from this investigation. Make no mistake, this is not an argument pertinent only to undergraduate studies. 4, the principles herein are applicable to every level of education, from kindergarten to postgraduate studies. My aim is to give an introduction and basic explanation of a Catholic liberal education. Okay, so part 1, the aim of education. In order to speak of education, we must first ask ourselves, what is the aim of education? We all typically spend the majority of the first quarter of our life pursuing an education. What is the intended result and goal of this endeavor? If you are a parent, you have likely fielded many questions from your children as they grow up asking this indirectly. Or perhaps you have asked them yourself growing up. Why do I have to study math? I will never use algebra in real life. Why do I care if a squared plus b squared equals c squared? Is diagramming sentences worth my time? Why am I putting words on slanted lines? I will never use that again. Our answers to these questions will vary greatly depending on our understanding of the aim we are seeking. Many think of education as a launch pad for worldly success. You have to study math because you will need it to be a good banker, a good engineer, a good accountant, etc. This approach, while stating something true, seems to fall short. A sign of this is that those answers almost never convince a teenager that they should care about the quadratic equation past their exam. Is all this time and effort spent merely to get the career we are aiming for? Another view is to ask ourselves what happiness is. What engenders a truly satisfying and good life? Isn't that what we want for all of us, for our kids? Is it the acclamation of material goods? Bishop Barron addresses this in his Catholicism series. Quote, "One of the most fundamental problems in the spiritual order is that we sense within ourselves the hunger for God, but we attempt to satisfy it with some created good that is less than God." St. Thomas Aquinas said that the 4 typical substitutes for God are wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. Sensing the void within, we attempt to fill it up with some combination of these 4 things. But only by emptying out the self in love can we make the space for God to fill us. The classical tradition referred to this errant desire as concupiscence, but I believe that we can neatly express the same idea with a more contemporary term, addiction. When we try to satisfy the hunger for God with something less than God, we will be naturally frustrated. We can find ourselves turning obsessively around this crucially good that can never, in principle, make us happy. End of quote. Since there's more to life, as I'm proposing here, than wealth, pleasure, power, or honor, it seems that education, in turn, should prepare us for more than just those. Dorothy Sayers once pondered the aim of education in her influential commencement address delivered at Oxford University in 1947. In this address, titled "The Lost Tools of Learning," she stated the following, quote, "The sole true end of education is simply this, to teach men how to learn for themselves, and whatever instruction fails to do this is effort spent in vain." End quote. This is a simple yet powerful definition proposed for the aim of education. It is quite notable that learning facts, figures, memorizing equations, algorithms, historical dates, not even knowing particular subjects or specializing in a particular field seems to be inherent in what education really is. Dorothy Sayers seems to be proposing that there's a prior and perhaps more encompassing goal to which it is to teach men how to think. Dorothy Sayers, in the same address to Oxford University, continued, quote, "I am concerned with the proper training of the mind to encounter and deal with the formidable mass of undigested problems presented to it by the modern world. For the tools of learning are the same in any and every subject, and the person who knows how to use them will at any age get the mastery of a new subject in half the time and with a quarter of the effort expended by the person who has not the tools at his command. To learn 6 subjects without remembering how they were learned does nothing to ease the approach to a 7th. To have learned and remembered the art of learning makes the approach to every subject an open door." End quote. Education, in this view, is the key to the world. Once this power is unlocked, all other educational powers become accessible all at once. Now, if we were to stop here, we would already be a good stride ahead of most schools. However, just having the tools to learn seems to point to a further end. The tools to learn what exactly? Archbishop Fulton Sheen also considered this aim of education, again in his Life is Worth Living series. He stated the following, quote, "The purpose of education is not primarily to train us for the democracy or to enable us to make a living. The purpose of education is to acquaint us with truth. Truth about everything." End quote. This is a helpful addition to Sayer's view because even if we have all the best tools of learning, yet never arrive at the end of truth, then in essence, we have failed. The excellent student who graduates high school and pursues a highly successful and prestigious career in journalism, for example, will have failed unless he were able and properly identify and understand and articulate the truth. This is why a Catholic education is a wholly different sort of thing than the modern, sterile, and atheistic education that is taught in many places. Education requires a search for truth, not contradicting with fragmented facts. Okay, part 2. Liberal education. Now that we have an idea of the proper aim of education, namely how to think and thus arrive at the truth, I want to discuss what is meant by a liberal education. This is perhaps the hardest part of my talk to understand. I believe, however, that in discussing the traits of such an education, we will see that a liberal education fulfills and exceeds this aim that we've just discussed. Now, our word liberal comes from the Latin word liber, meaning free. Thus, liberal education means the education of a free man. To understand what an education of a free man is, we have to first understand what freedom is. The common notion of freedom in our time, and particularly in America, is as Wikipedia defines it. Quote, "The right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint." End quote. However, acting, speaking, or thinking without any parameters whatsoever is not freedom, but anarchy. Let us take an example. Am I free to communicate with you right at this moment? It would seem so, for I am articulating clear and comprehensible sounds to you all. At least I hope they're comprehensible. Of course, I am not free to communicate by making whatever sounds I want. It is precisely the opposite. I am most free to speak to you because I'm rigidly adhering to an expansive and rigorous set of rules that govern words, pronunciation, sentence structure, and voice inflection. Freedom only has meaning within boundaries. Men are not free, as Wikipedia indicates, by acting, speaking, or thinking as they want without restraint. Instead, true freedom is formed by an acceptance of certain fundamental principles about ourselves and the natural world. In order to be free, one has to have an idea of one's nature and final end are. Okay, to better understand what a free man is, we can contrast with those who are not free, such as prisoners or slaves. This is the easiest way to illustrate an idea is taking the extreme example. Prisoners and slaves are trapped to live a certain way, not because it is naturally fulfilling for them, but because they are forced to. We all recognize that no one wants to live this way, and such a life is not a happy life. Now, a liberal education proposes to teach men how to be free, not in the sense that it frees us from forced or physical forms of slavery or imprisonment, but because it helps us free us from the sort of slavery and imprisonment that is natural to all of us. Let me explain what I mean. For example, like prisoners and slaves who are put in a position that prevents us from living as they would naturally like to live, all of us, unfortunately, find ourselves born in a condition that prevents us from living as we would naturally like to live. This is the result of original sin. All men desire a happy and good life, yet we are unable to identify and pursue the life that makes us truly happy. Even worse, we easily tend to sin with all its negative consequences. Hence, many end up navigating this unfortunate state by a long and painful trial and error process, of which has no guarantee of finding the actual lasting and true happiness by which we all desire by nature. Moreover, not only do all men by nature desire to live a truly happy life, all men also by nature desire to know and understand the world around us, to know why the sun and moon roam the sky, what the cause of the seasons are, what impels the animals to pursue their tasks, and why gravity acts in the matter the way it does. No man wants to be stuck in ignorance without an understanding. This is very clear with young children. I have 2 young children, and that is how they spend all of their time, trying to understand the world. For them, it usually means putting something in their mouth, or climbing onto a window ledge, or scaring our new chickens half to death. And this illustrates that everyone is born in total ignorance of the world, and when we try to understand it, much like my kids, we find ourselves more prone to error and misconceptions rather than simple and easy discovery of truth. All men desire to be free from error, misconceptions, ignorance, and unhappiness, but sadly find that these evils come much more easily than their opposites. So, a liberal education is an education in which we learn truths of the world that we naturally desire to understand, and which frees us from ignorance, error, and misconceptions regarding such truths. Secondly, an education in which we learn truths that teach us how to become happy and good is also properly called a liberal education, because knowledge of the right way to live sets us free from ignorance. This is the most technical part. Therefore, a liberal education can be described by having 2 principal parts. The first part is called theoretical, and the second is commonly called moral or practical philosophy. The theoretical part refers to the first part of a liberal education. That is, it frees us from misconceptions and errors concerning truths that we naturally desire to know for their own sake. And by the way, theoretical does not mean that it is uncertain, but rather opposed to practical. It looks at truths we naturally desire to know, not because we use them for some further purpose. The second part of a liberal education, namely moral or practical philosophy, frees us from misconceptions about the way to live in order to become good and happy human beings. It is called liberal because it frees us from the inability to direct ourselves toward a life worth living, specifically by freeing us from the ignorance and error that can trap us in vice and unhappiness. In so doing, it equips us with knowledge that can help us direct ourselves to virtue and happiness and avoid vice and misery themselves. It is important to note, though, that this second principal part we have described cannot accomplish the complete avoidance of sin, vice, and unhappiness all by itself. Make no mistake. That is to say, as any teacher will know, education cannot make someone a good person. We also need grace and many other things, which are goods outside of education. So moral or practical philosophy is not be able to completely on its own accomplish its aim. It is nonetheless a critical part of getting there and does deserve to be called liberal in the knowledge it imparts to help us free us from vice and unhappiness. In the same vein, I also do not want to convey the idea that upon graduation from a liberal education, this pursuit is completed. A good Catholic liberal education will only be able to give the students a good beginning to the life of wisdom and freedom. And this pursuit is indeed a lifelong pursuit. Now, before moving on, there's one more aspect of liberal education worth mentioning. While I won't have time to go into the particulars of a curriculum that make up a liberal education, it is worth noting that the parts therein are studied together, must be studied in one integrated whole. This is an important point. Since a liberal education seeks to satisfy the desire of the student to know truth, it must actively explore the relations of science or subjects within one another. It is implicit that truth is one, and thus all the sciences from math and biology to literature and philosophy and theology must all be unified and complement one another. 4, if a conclusion is reached in biology that seems to indicate a disagreement about a conclusion reached in, say, theology, what progress will be made in setting man free in the life of wisdom unless he is further able to explore this connection and apparent contradiction? If the study of these two sciences, or any sciences studied apart from one another, it will be impossible to have a unified understanding of truth and reality. Even worse, and unfortunately more common, is that one might not realize the subtle undermining and contradictory views presented by specialized courses of different sciences to him. Or, if he does realize this but does not have the tools and freedom to explore it properly, the predictable result will be skepticism. Since the student will be at a loss as to how to reconcile these positions. And skepticism is a tragic result because it ultimately defeats the entire purpose of learning and denies that anything can be proven or that we can truly know anything. Another way of stating this is, how many of you know someone who will freely state something along these lines? Science shows that there is no need for a creator. Therefore, why should I believe in a God? The good news is that as Catholics, we do believe in one God, who is truth itself. An integrated curriculum is necessary to be able to see and understand the truths about ourselves and the world. Fulton Sheen, when asked about the siloed, unrelated, and disjointed curriculums many follow today, stated the following, quote, "The result is that students are not getting the education they ought to receive. They only get a congeries of unrelated, disconnected, and disjointed subjects, which they and no one else can put together. An encyclopedia is not educated, despite its bursting knowledge, because it lacks the power to coordinate one subject with another. A truly educated man, on the contrary, sees a relationship between subjects as he sees coordination in his own body and the universe. Any system of electives which ignores the unity of knowledge and the overall purpose of life confuses the student rather than perfects him in truth." End quote. Hence, it is critical to have a unifying and governing principle under which education can be considered one if it is to pursue truth. Luckily, for us Catholics, this is exactly what theology proposes to be for a Catholic liberal education. This is the good part. Part 3, Catholic education. Before we consider how theology orders and unifies a liberal education, let us first ask, what is it that makes an education Catholic? Often I speak to high school students, and I like to ask them this question, and most will give me answers such as one of the following: a theology class, or Catholic teachers, or having Mass at the school, or my personal favorite, a Catholic vibe and culture. You can tell at last answers from a high schooler. While each of these answers does have some truth to it, none of them define what it is that makes an education Catholic. Most answers are more concerned with the atmosphere of a school rather than anything academic, and none of these are exclusive to a Catholic school as a whole cohesive identity. I would like to propose that what makes an education Catholic across every level of schooling is summarized well by St. Anselm, who famously coined the phrase fides querens intellectum, which is Latin for faith seeking understanding. This summarizes the nature of the pursuit of truth under the light of faith, for which is the defining characteristic of a true Catholic school. A desire to understand more perfectly, to see as much as is possible what is first believed. St. Anselm expounds on this by way of a beautiful prayer. Lord, I am not trying to make my way to your height, for my understanding is in no way equal to that. But I do desire to understand a little of your truth, which my heart already believes and loves. I do not seek to understand so that I can believe, but I believe so that I may understand. And what is more, I believe that unless I do believe, I shall not understand. That's a beautiful prayer. And here, St. Anselm claims not only that the believer seeks to understand what he holds by faith, but that his belief is itself an aid in the pursuit of the truth. The Church teaches that faith perfects reason and allows one to see deeper insights into truths than reason could ever achieve on its own accord. And let me give an example for you. This is something I studied in college. An example of this is how divine foreknowledge is consistent with free choice, or free will. Most thinkers, philosophers, theologians who have considered this matter have concluded that they are logically incompatible and have either confirmed divine foreknowledge at the expense of free choice or maintained free choice by denying divine foreknowledge. You can have one or the other. There are many examples of these positions by many prominent authors. St. Augustine, however, clearly showed that sacred scripture teaches both the infallible foreknowledge of God and the freedom of the will. This proved to St. Augustine that the contradiction was only apparent and that these previous understandings of both divine foreknowledge and the nature of the human will were inadequate. I'd love to say more on this, but that is for another time. The point is here, this example illustrates, as could many more, that the Catholic faith is a guide in the intellectual life for those who subject themselves to it, and that the understanding is crippled when it refuses to stand in the rays of that divine light. The acceptance and submission in faith to divine renders the whole of Catholic education to be fundamentally superior to and different from any education which is not under the guidance of the Catholic faith and church teaching. Now, bring this all together. A Catholic education and a liberal education, when brought together, becomes greater than the sum of its parts. For theology is the principal part of a liberal education seeking freedom. In fact, once freedom is properly understood, true liberal education cannot take place in spite of or even apart from the Christian faith. Rather, the Christian student, because of his faith, can be liberally educated in the most perfect and complete way. Therefore, liberal education, undertaken by Christians in order to theology, turns out to be liberal education in its most true form. This is why a Catholic liberal education can claim to be the most excellent of educations, because through wisdom based on faith, the student's natural appetite for the truth can be perfectly satisfied as much as possible on this side of eternity. Okay, this is my last part 4. At this point, you might be thinking, gosh, John, this sounds great, but what do you do with this? So in closing, though accidental to the central focus of this topic, I would like to comment briefly on the consideration of the practicality of such an education. I knew that this question could not be avoided, so I wanted to say something on these last words. By no means do I claim to be exhaustive in this consideration, nor is it my aim to convince you of the value of this education because of the practical benefits. That is not what I'm proposing. My hope is that all I have previously just stated was sufficient and satisfactory enough to give a clear understanding of what a Catholic liberal education is, and gives you more than enough reason to consider the value of such an education in however it most pertains to your life. Now, when I was writing this, I came up with over 12 reasons, distinct reasons for practical benefits that can then follow. We do not have time for that. The point being is that practically speaking, I believe that a Catholic liberal education is one of the most practical things that a student can undertake in today's world. There are numerous reasons for this, and while I want to summarize those and highlight the following ones. And the first one is a career point. Recently, a secular sports writer named David Epstein wrote a wildly popular book titled Range. I highly recommend reading it. In it, he considers whether it is more beneficial to focus on a specialized skill set or to produce the fastest head start in a given career field, or if it is more beneficial to maintain a well-balanced range of skill sets and then apply it to a given career field. He explores this idea in everything from students, professional athletes, musicians, artists, scientists, global financial forecasters, etc. The results may surprise you upon looking at the evidence in that it overwhelmingly supports a pursuit of acquired a well-balanced range of abilities. This is true of many metrics, including strictly monetary, one thing I was even surprised to find. In other words, this author presents a strong secular defense of the benefits for the kind of education I have just described. Now, the truth confirms this. As I can tell you, graduates from a Catholic liberal education go into every kind of career field that one can imagine, and the majority do so without going on to a graduate school. Further, if you have a son or daughter, let's say, who wants to be a doctor, lawyer, or scientist, the truth is that the path and the timeline of what it would look for them to get to that will look almost identical whether a student enrolls at the closest state school or a Catholic liberal education. In fact, the applicant from a liberal education will actually be more attractive to graduate schools, not less. Just as Range predicts, the same is true for business and the working world. The world is starved for men and women who can think critically, clearly, and independently. Since the dawn of the internet, information has become a commodity. The skill that inversely becomes much more valuable is knowing how to understand and manage and direct information in the most effective ways. Now, the last point is a spiritual point, and I can give many of these, but I'll summarize in giving one. There is a saying nowadays that one of the worst things you can do for your child's faith is to send them to a Catholic school. In fact, Barna research shows that over 80% of students lose their faith during college. This is precisely the opposite for a genuine Catholic liberal education. It is precisely under the conditions that I've described in which one's faith can grow tremendously. And lastly, and most importantly, this education, once properly understood, is ultimately training for happiness. What could be more important than that? Thank you, and God bless you.